Welcome to the latest installment of the Sharp Best Ball Show. I'm your host, Tod Burros. You can find me on Twitter at BestBallNFL. I'm joined again, our first returning champion to the Best Ball Pod, Rich Hribar, Lord Reeves on Twitter. Rich is the king of Sharp football rankings, and he set off a firestorm on Twitter over the last week with some of his rankings, which really surprised me, Rich, because I really, as I got prepared for this pod, I really don't see much that's controversial. What set Twitter off so bad? What triggered Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think just social media is going to be social media. I think our boss at editor-in-chief here, Warren Sharp, tickled some people here by kind of presenting maybe the quarterback rankings as real quarterback rankings. That always is going to trigger the masses as well. But, people will find always something that stands out. I always think it's really fun when people disagree with your rankings, but only have a guy one or two spots away and they want to argue about it, like sword and shield. It's come on, man. We're talking about the QB7 versus the QB9. We don't need to, pull out knives here.
Yeah, I didn't even make questions for the pod based on that, right? I at least looked for things that, a couple things. My article this week was on assumptions, right? And we have to make assumptions in fantasy football, especially for best ball, right? Season long, we have what last year's numbers were, but that's no guarantee. Right. And we also don't know who's going to fit what role. And, so there's a lot of assumptions, but it's very easy for assumptions to turn into biases. And biases blind you and can cause you to either not get away from people you should, or not get on guys that you didn't like, even though there's good reason why. So I love episodes like this because it can challenge my biases, and I'm open to your thoughts on assumptions and biases and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about the marriage of this time of year when you're looking at, projections, the first thing I ever do is start to plug in my projections this time of year, especially post-draft, and we know where the rookies are going. And we're starting to really see these rosters kind of be 95% done across the league. We'll have some straggler free agents, maybe some injuries, change some things, but we get the projections, and the projections kind of roll into and mold those kind of initial rankings. But then also, you don't want to do them as a one-for-one, right? You don't want to just rank off your projections, because we're talking about median outcomes, right? And fantasy football is so much more than that. So many of these things are going to be fluid through injuries, guys just not playing well. If the offenses just aren't as good as we expect, and that's where kind of I like the best ball minds a lot, because best ball is already thinking big range of outcomes anyways. Over the redraft outcomes. But I love trying to find that marriage of projections and rankings and then range of outcomes, and kind of trying to put those together this time of year, because not all of those things are going to totally manifest themselves in a linear list fashion, which people love rankings. The internet loves lists anyways. Give us some lists already. It doesn't matter
that's because they want to argue. They don't want to get better. They want to argue. And to me, that whole mindset is a defeated mindset, right? If you only want to argue, to me, you're already behind the eight ball. Because to me, here's my first question, and we'll lead with it. Let's start at running back, where you're lower on the field than Bijan Robinson. I tend to agree with you. There's more risk than the field is baking in, especially in half PPR. With that in mind, if you were doing 100 best balls, how many Bijans would you target? And so what that's meant to do is challenge my own viewpoint on it. And as we go through these questions, you'll see I'm looking to make sure that I'm not wrong. And the reason is because I have been wrong so often. And, you finally start thinking through your brain, I should do less arguing and more listening, Rich.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I would love 100 Bijans if I could get 100 Bijans. Unfortunately, that's not always the world we live in because there are things that have capital and cost, unfortunately. But it's really interesting. Obviously, we have a player that's never played down in the NFL. He is a really kind of a lightning rod prospect in terms of maybe being the best pure running back prospect that we've had since Saquon Barkley in 2018. He checks just about every box. He lands into a spot that's committed to run the football. But also, like, what if Desmond Ritter's not good? This is a team that also didn't throw to running backs at all last year. You think it would increase, but when we're trying to project those types of things, it's kind of a gray area, right? Like, there's still realistically a theoretical chance that as good of a receiver Bijan Robinson is, we can't even get enough targets for the guys we know that are good, like Drake London and Kyle Pitts, right? Like, we want those guys to get more targets in this offense, let alone the running back. So, I mean, what if he only catches, 35 or 40 passes, right? Instead of, 60 to 70, that skims a lot off of the floor and the potential ceiling outcome, especially in overall. What if he just doesn't have the touchdown luck, right? There's all these different variables that kind of play into it. And the running back position itself is wide open. So that's why he's getting pushed. You look at the unique landscape that is 2023 fantasy drafts. I mean, every running back has question marks. I cannot remember a year like this since maybe 2016, the year after Devontae Freeman was the RB1 in fantasy football. I mean, you can pick apart all these guys, even Christian McCaffrey, who literally has been a top 5 running back every year he's played fantasy football. You look at his splits without Elijah Mitchell. Are the 49ers going to try to keep him fresh? Are they afforded that opportunity? Austin Eckler is going to be 28 years old. He's coming off a career high 300 touches. Does he have the touchdown luck he's had the past 2 years? It just immediately gets into like this kind of really area where it's easy to take apart these running backs. So it's easy to say, we've got this new shiny toy, let's push him up the board, right? And especially some of the receivers that he goes next to as well. So obviously, ideal world, I would love 100 Bijans if I could have 100 Bijans. But with him already being kind of priced almost really behind Austin Eckler, it's really hard for me to get 100 Bijans. And then the secondary conversation is what are you playing, right? So Todd, I know you're a guy that does a lot of tournament best ball play, right? So you're thinking about these portfolios and how you're going to build them out. But I don't play a lot of tournaments. I do, sprinkle in enough lottery tickets as I want, but I feel like the best ball community has gotten like steered away from, winning ROI, right? Like winning these leagues, right? Winning these 12-man leagues, these 10-man leagues. These are like, best ball is still a very winnable game if you can turn your 8.5% inherent win rate into a 12.5%, a 14%, and your ROI is going to look really good. And then you use your lottery tickets to kind of just be fun money, right? That's how we play DFS in tournaments, cash games versus tournament play. So if you're in a tournament and you're trying to max out the best ball mania 3 or something, like, you can't ignore and have 0 Bijan Robinson, even if I'm a little bit lower than the field. You might come underweight a little bit, but you still have to have him, right? Because what if he is the RB1 in those types of scenarios? But if you're just playing in leagues, right, and you're not really worried about the portfolio aspect, you don't necessarily have to have any of them.
Yeah. So a couple really good points there. One, that's why most of my money goes to the FFPC. And I feel like it's because it's a hybrid. It's a tournament, but you could get on DraftKings or Underdog. It's very close between them. A 17% advance rate is average, kind of ties into what you were talking about with old-fashioned best ball winning 8%, right? 17%. If you get a 30% advance rate and you have a pretty good first week of the playoffs, you're still going to be down about 25 to 30% of your money. Never mind if you don't have a good advance rate, right? So on the FFPC, it's $125, but you get $300 for advancing, right? So, if I do 100 FFPCs, that's 12,500. If I get that 30%, I'm already back 9,000 out of my 12,500. If I get and they advance more teams as well in the tournament. The first week is 2 out of 12, so that's another 17%. Let's say you get 20. That's 9 teams. That's another 9 times another 600. I mean, you're basically profitable with 2 really good weeks. So it's not a cash game, but I think that's a very good point that you make. My fear with Bijan, I mean, I see him go top 5. I think there's too much opportunity cost. We talk about that a lot in DFS too. There's running back values right now throughout the draft boards to take a guy like Bijan over a Stephon Diggs, over a Cooper Kupp, over sometimes Jamar Chase. I mean, to me, I just think that's too high of a price. I'd like to at least be even weight on Bijan, but if he's not, like he came, I was on the clock 10th the other day, and I took him just so I would get one because I haven't had one for a while. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you just, like I said, if your portfolio building out where you're going to max enter these tournaments or you're going to come close to it, you have to, right? Like you have to just swallow it sometimes and try to make some different unique builds. Because the other thing too is when you're doing that, you don't want to fall into this rut where you're just like consistently drafting the same guys at the same position, right? You're going to end up with a lot of rosters that look the same. And then if you don't hit and you're eating up a large portion of that. So you are going to have to just mix that in with those tournaments when you're trying to build out that like big portfolio.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is absolutely correct.
And even players that, you might not even like love that are just up there, right? Like, like let's just use Ramondre Stevenson as an example, right? Like there's a lot of fragility, like there's a lot of upside in there too. So but like you think about like the players he's next to, it's like, man, am I really going to take, Ramondre Stevenson over, an established player? Like we know that's like multi-years of like being a good player. It might be the right move, but it's hard to get over that mental block. So you just have to mix it in, right? When you're doing this, when you're building out like these large portfolios and this large, sample size of entries, you gotta mix it up a little bit and see what some things look like.
Biggest fight that I have with other high-end best ball players, not the average fan, the guys who are playing my kind of volume, is my reticence to go above 15% in the first 2 rounds and 25% overall. I get a lot of people saying, no risk it, no biscuit. And I'm like, dude, injuries happen. Injuries don't care, right? The different, like you do these rankings, right? The difference between the 7th and the 9th guy maybe is 20 points, 30 points over a year, which over, a 14-week regular season is 1 to 2 points. That pales into it, because if someone gets hurt for the year, now you're bleeding 14, 15 points. You put 30% on a guy in the first 2 rounds, and the chance of injury is much greater in my mind than anything that you like or don't like about a player going that early, because everyone going that early is talented and has pretty good opportunity, Rich.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it from a projection stance, which kind of illuminates some of this, the wide receiver position definitely stands out. But you get to like basically where I have these projections, and you get to like wide receiver 14, and like wide receiver 14 to like wide receiver 32, we're talking like 20 points of projection over a full season, right? Like it's a huge tier of guys, but when you put them in a linear list and you're like, hey, you have this guy 14 and this guy 26, it's a wide gap, right? It's not nearly as wide as that linear list makes it look.
And that's why A, I mix it up. B, in big tournaments, I'm willing to reach once in a while to be unique, because it's, especially if there's a correlation there, week 17. I think that's the most subtle thing about best ball tournaments, that not like I said, not the average player, the guys who are really, putting 15, 20 grand. I get into these arguments and I'm like, you do realize I'm not going to have any of this guy. Really? You're not going to have anything, the rest of the field thinks a guy's a 2nd round wide receiver and you want 0. Right? Because you have it in your head that, anyway, Let's
It's
move
a humbling
on.
game, man. It's a hard game to
It really is.
to operate with complete hubris. We've all been humbled in this space.
I've spent so much more time this year checking my facts, watching tape. I'm good at tape, especially for running back. Matt Harmon's, who's going to come on at some point, his reception perception. Really double checking my biases and assumptions versus what the work that other people do, because it's so, like 2 years ago, if you didn't have the correlation of Amon-Ra St. Brown and Rashad Penny the last 2 weeks, you weren't winning money, right? And I had very little Amon-Ra St. Brown. Why? I had a bias against him. Why? I don't know. I just didn't work. I didn't do the work. So let's keep going through these. I noticed Jonathan Taylor. You have not a lot lower, but you have Taylor behind Tony Pollard at 7th. Your thoughts on Pollard over Taylor, and in general, what is it about Taylor that makes you nervous?
Yeah, so if you followed my work over the years, I mean, obviously in 2018, I put out an article at RotoWorld about the impact that rookie quarterbacks have on NFL offenses and how that relates to fantasy football. And as excited we are about Anthony Richardson and his fantasy value, and especially getting that premier draft capital, which is a signal that he could start as early as week 1 now, and we get a full season out of this mobile quarterback, this hybrid quarterback. But
I absolutely think he does start week 1.
Yeah, I agree too. But what these guys do to their skill players historically has been a nightmare. All these guys have completely underperformed, especially at wide receiver and running back. You look at first round quarterbacks since 2000, 75% of those running backs have had a dip in production year over year with that rookie quarterback. Now, for Jonathan Taylor to be worse than he was last year for fantasy is probably a bar that he can get over, but how much ceiling does he have? Even his RB1 season 2 years ago was the lowest scoring RB1 season of the last decade. So, you factor that in. Also got, Michael Pittman, it just absolutely kills him. And then when you factor in the type of quarterback Anthony Richardson is, right? And what he does, like historically, guys that are in the mold of Anthony Richardson don't throw to their running backs. So how many catches do we get out of Jonathan Taylor? Is it a situation where he's got to house all these long runs? He's a premier talent, though. I mean, he is a guy I've always said is like the modern Adrian Peterson. Like, he's the current version of what Adrian Peterson is a runner. Is he ever going to have like 60 catches? Probably not in a year, but he's this guy that can just take any handoff, 60 yards for a touchdown like AP was, back in the day. But I just think when you compare him to some of the other running backs that are at the top there, and you factor in that rookie quarterback historically has lowered these guys' expectations, that's something I'm always, cognizant of. And I just kind of keep him in like that mid RB1 type of range, especially with him not catching as many passes as he did. He's one of those guys, like we talked about, like because of that, though, like I need to force some Jonathan Taylor into these tournaments, because if I am wrong, we get to, week, 17 and they're playing the Raiders, which is an extremely stackable game, right? I want to be able to have some of that.
Absolutely. So I mentioned 15%. I also don't like being under 4 on first and second round guys. I've been wrong too often. I've just been wrong too often. Now, on your point, the one guy that I'm not worried about, because I think the quarterback is an absolute upgrade, is Stroud replacing what's his name, Davis Mills. Mm-hmm. I think that Stroud is not going to hurt Dameon Pierce. Your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, Dameon Pierce is tricky because I love him as a player. I mean, even going back to, that last season at Florida, everyone, has seen that touchdown that he scores without a helmet. I think he actually reversed the touchdown because his helmet came off, but everyone's seen the run. I mean, he's that kind of guy. But when you factor in like where he's at with Houston now, and is Houston going to be an offense, like where do they go? Is this a team that's going to be able to get out of the bottom third of the league? Then you add Devin Singletary. This is already a guy that didn't catch any passes last year. And then you talk about the way he ended last season, Dameon Pierce. I mean, it was just absolutely brutal. It was like an unrosterable player. He rushed for hurt. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he even before that, I mean, he had a 4-week stretch where he had 170 rushing yards total. Didn't catch three or more passes a game. So it's just really kind of hard when you factor in the environment. I love the player. I don't love the situation. I don't love that they added a guy that I don't believe is really any good, but it doesn't matter what I think, right? If they like Devin Singletary, I'm talking Devin Singletary.
Right. I look at Singletary more as a guy who's going to replace Rex Burkhead than, Pierce got a lot of carries. He was 5th or 6th in broken yards after contact, right below Nick Chubb last year. They brought Shaq Mason. This is my counterpoint to that. They brought Shaq Mason over. They've upgraded they also took a 4th-round pick in the offensive line.
They took a 1st-rounder last year too. So
yeah, the defense is going to be better, I think, as well. And although, in other words, Stroud's an upgrade, enhanced weapons, and half offensive line. One of the reasons that Stroud did bomb so badly last year is they were 3-4 touchdowns down every week in the second quarter. So I do think there's I don't like him in full PPR, and I think either next week or the week after, what I'm going to do, one of those old articles that we always did in DFS, go site by site, compare ADP, and like Dameon Pierce's ADP really isn't much different on a full PPR than a half PPR by much. But to me, I'm very interested in a guy like that in half PPR. I'm not as interested in a full PPR.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of those guys, like, if you follow me, as you've listened to me over the years, like, I hate drafting players on bad teams. It's just like a bias I have.
Fair point.
It's just something, like, and I don't believe Houston's going to be any good, but I actually do love Dameon Pierce, the player, so you're right. Maybe I should, pepper him in a little bit more, just because of the fact I do believe that he is a talented player and a talented runner. And if we can just luck box into, maybe 8 touchdowns, we'll be okay.
Well, 8 touchdowns, and then I think that's very doable. I think that also, again, if he's actually on the field in the 3rd and 4th quarter, and when you're down 2-3 touchdowns, you're not going to get the rock as a running back. So I think I can tell myself a story, and I like betting on his talent. You are higher on James Cook, even in half PPR, and less high on Damien Harris. And half PPR, I've been taking more Harris. Your thoughts? I mean, you have a pretty good spread on them, more than what I'm seeing on the sites. What is it that you like so much about Cook?
Really, just it's the range of outcomes, right? So Damien Harris, a very good running back, but he's going to fit very specific team builds, right? For him to kind of have like true RB1 upside, he has to score a lot of touchdowns. He probably has to have an injury to James Cook to amass the amount of volume, because he's only going to get rushing attempts as touches. So those guys fit a very specific team build, right? Like you're going your 0 RB or wide receiver heavy. And he very well could be a guy that has like a Jamal Williams type of season last year, right? Where he just doesn't catch any passes, but has 15 touchdowns because the offense he's in. That exists. But James Cook's like ceiling outcome, he is one of these guys that can do it all and is in this elite offense already. So what if from a projection stance, we're not going to project James Cook because of Josh Allen, because of Damien Harris, to have all of these rushing attempts and all these rushing touchdowns. But what if the workload is higher because of those things are getting over factored in? We have a guy that averaged over 6 yards per touch as a rookie. He already was one of the most efficient receiving backs in the NFL as a rookie. He was he was 6th among all running backs in carries that resulted in a first down or touchdown. So the run out for like a player like that, like what's the difference between the range of outcomes for James Cook and Jahmyr Gibbs, right? On a ceiling perspective. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs' median projection's a lot better because he's got that insulation of the receptions. But James Cook's ceiling outcome should be just as good as Jahmyr Gibbs, right? Like if everything broke his way, the way that people wanted to break from Jahmyr Gibbs, well, that's arbitrage.
I can't draft Jahmyr Gibbs at ADP, especially in a half PPR in the 3rd round, end of the 3rd. I will take him if he falls mid-4th in a full PPR, again, just to have some. I really like Montgomery. I feel that a couple years ago, I had a lot of Swift and almost no Jamal Williams. Swift was going in the 4th. Jamal Williams was going in the 11th. I thought that was out of balance, right? So I was heavy on Swift. Next year, Swift was in the 2nd. Jamal Williams was in like the 16th. And I said, all right, the balance is out of balance the other way. And I had about 25% Jamal Williams, and that really helped me a tremendous amount last year. Right now, I think Montgomery is out of balance with Jahmyr Gibbs because, I think he's going to he can catch the ball. They have a great offensive line near the goal line. Gibbs couldn't even get on the field at Alabama in the red zone. So that's one that I'm heavy on Monty in that one. And I actually am willing to take both Cook and Damien Harris on certain teams because if I've got 1 or 2 good running backs in front of me, I feel like every week one of those guys is going to give me a usable score. And if there's an injury, then, it's like trading a 8th and a 10th or a 9th and 11th round pick for a 2nd round guy if one of them gets hurt. I call it stack cuffing. And my favorite one to do that with this year is Damien Harris and James Cook.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get because you look at like a projection stance, like a guy like James Cook is not going to.
Let me just interject. I think that's only a best ball thing. I don't because I don't
do that in real life.
Correct. You can't do that in redraft because you have to pick.
You have to set a lineup. You have to set a lineup every week. But yeah, I mean, I don't think people are looking at like the potential high end range of outcomes for James Cook because of the projection and median kind of outcome. What's interesting though is everyone's doing the opposite for a guy like DeAndre Swift, right? Like DeAndre Swift still being drafted as where we're factoring in this elite run out, right? Because he's another guy that doesn't project well now going from Detroit to Philadelphia because how many targets can he get? Obviously, Rashod Penny's an excellent and efficient runner, but he's still being kind of drafted as
Kenneth Gainwell is still alive last I checked.
But he's still being drafted at that, like, well, this scenario exists where what if it's all this work? He gets all this work. But like James Cook doesn't have any of that really factor in. He still kind of goes around RB30 like all the time. But he absolutely has one of those ranges of outcomes where like, what if he just got a lot more work? This is the team that took him the 2nd round last year. Yeah. I feel
they talked about giving him more work as soon as the year ended. And then they let Singletary go, who they liked as a player and as a person. Yes, they replaced him with Damien Harris. Early on, I was all over James Cook, and then they signed Damien Harris, and he was going 2-3 rounds later. And especially half PPR, I like Damien Harris. I'll take the discount. But I'm glad we had – this is what I mean, because you find yourself shifting. I had just started getting back on my radar to take more James Cook. So I'm really glad you mentioned it because I really do feel like what you're saying about his ceiling is absolutely true.
Yeah, like I said, I always bring up the word arbitrage. So we think like player archetypes, how they're utilized. And think about those 3 players that we just laid out. You have Jahmyr Gibbs where his ADP is, then you have DeAndre Swift, and you have James Cook. But what's like the true difference of what types of players they are and what offenses they're in, right? It's not wide. We're not talking about a very wide gap here, but that's how you can use arbitrage to your advantage. That's how you can tier guys up and use them properly. You're going through the draft board.
I love that. Maybe we'll have another pod later before the season where we do an arbitrage pod. I think that is a term that I've heard for season long in certain things in fantasy. DFS, but I really haven't heard that term in best ball. And I think that's another way to kind of look for opportunity that I really like. I do want to talk about Kenneth Walker. He is probably the most polarizing guy on Twitter. And he was going, locked in as a mid to late 2nd round pick in early best ball. They get Charbonnet, who I do like, but I didn't like him as a prospect nearly as much as Walker. Walker has that home run ability. Mm-hmm. He's now going like I see him mid-5th, and it's really hard for me to pass on a guy as talented as him in the 5th round. And your rankings have Walker definitely higher than what the field is saying now. What are your thoughts on Kenneth Walker, and where would you be willing to start taking him?
Yeah, Kenneth Walker is a guy, I think, especially in these best ball drafts, especially on underdog, the way underdog scoring works, that the market has just overthought or overcorrected on from where it was,
Right.
Pre-draft and then post-draft. One, for this type of format, he's exactly what you look for, because he's going to drop really crooked numbers on you. He's going to have games where he has these 50, 60-yard touchdowns. He's a very boomer bust runner. He was that way in college at Michigan State. He was that way as a rookie. We shouldn't really anticipate him to be anything different. But the big numbers are going to be really big, and you don't take on any of these games like in a redraft league where he might not catch a pass. He doesn't score a touchdown. He gives you, 67 hollow yards for fantasy. You don't get any of those in this format. So be able to get him in like the 5th round. And I think it's just underdog in general, which is so wide receiver heavy, has pushed him down. I think when you get to your season long leagues come August, like you probably won't see a lot of 5th round Kenneth Walker, even in full point PPR. When we're doing
There's a lot of Charbonnet stands out there. I like Charbonnet. See, he's the type of guy I normally wouldn't have drafted in the past because I think Walker's the better back. But Charbonnet is now also dropping a bit. He's in the 10th. And I think he is another, him and Elijah Mitchell are guys that I love taking if I've already got 2 stud running backs or 2 to 3 very good running backs in the first 10 rounds. Give me a Mitchell or a Charbonnet who are one injury away from being monsters in run-heavy offenses.
And we already have proof that Kenneth Walker is a relatively, productive player in the NFL and can be a productive runner, even for like the shortcomings he had in terms of success rate or negative runs. We do already have proof that what he was good at in college has translated and was, successful in the NFL. And Seattle's just not going to ignore that, right? Like there's not going to be probably a scenario where this ends up being like a 50-50 split. Like the talent is going to probably win out a little bit in terms of the split. What you worry about for Charbonnet is if he ends up being like a better grinder, like because he could weasel his way into the short yardage opportunities, right?
He is good at that.
Yeah, and that's what you just worry about, that in the range of outcomes for Kenneth Walker is if Kenneth Walker ends up being this true home run or strikeout runner, does Seattle when they have a 3rd and 2 then want to say, all right, well, this could be a home run, or we can't pick up this first down. Maybe we just put in the guy that's going to get us the 3 or 4 that we know, but maybe doesn't have the ceiling outcome. That's what you kind of worry about if that does to happen. But we're not expecting any of the Seahawks guys to catch a ton of passes anyways. I mean, he's a guy I think that everything overcorrected on a little bit, and everyone's thinking that it's the end is nigh for Kenneth Walker. But I mean, I still think when you look at the guys he goes around, I mean, I still want Kenneth Walker, especially in these best ball formats where I'm taking on the best scores. I don't have to get him right on the weeks where he has, like I said, those like 65-yard games. It seems like it's just such a layup pick where he's at. But I think that's just where the landscape is right now on underdog versus kind of where we'll end and where the pucks can end up getting to towards the end of August. So I think you just grab Kenneth Walker now, because I think when we get there, it'll flip a little bit and he's going to rise when we get to the summer.
I'm not so sure because Charbonnet seems to be a Twitter darling, and sometimes the hype doesn't stop. I do want to throw in one other thought here. Walker, remember that one run right near the goal line where he hurt his ankle, and the next 2 to 3 weeks his numbers were down. I think one of the edges that's available still is we account for points per game, but we don't account for guys who don't miss games but play through injuries that knock down their ability. And Kenneth Walker had about 3 games where he just wasn't, you didn't see that big upside that you had seen in other games. And I can tell myself a story that it's injury related, Rich.
Yeah, and you can do that with a number of guys. I mean, T. Higgins obviously has 3 games that count against him where he really didn't even play in. Jerry Jeudy is another guy. When you look at like Jerry Jeudy, he didn't miss a ton of time, but he also didn't have a ton of games where he played like a high allotment of snaps. But when he did, he was excellent. I mean, Jerry Jeudy last year only had 11 games where he played 60% of team snaps or more. But in those games, he was a wide receiver 2 or better in 8 of those 11 weeks.
I love Judy this year.
And when you start factoring in like all these other things that go into points per game, you lose out on that. Anytime you can start getting into the weeds on that under the hood, you can tell yourself kind of a false lead, but it definitely is a step beyond just using points per game too, and kind of looking at just the full games they played or when these guys had, their full time. Then when you get into splits, it's easier to kind of to get lost in the shuffle. But there's all these guys where you factor in like guys missing time, right? Brandon Ayuk's been like that his whole career. Brandon Ayuk has 11 wide receiver 1 scoring games in his career, but 6 of those have come with Deebo Samuel not even playing, right? So it's really hard.
Same thing with McCaffrey and Elijah Mitchell.
I mean, there's all these like different variables that go into it, and those are things like when you talking about it. I think the best ball community does a better job of it than the redraft community because we're not drafting as many teams in redraft, I think, as best ball, but best ball is really good a lot this time of year of guys walking through the scenarios of what happens if this domino falls and what does that mean, as opposed to when we get to August where you might only be drafting 5 redraft teams and you're saying I'm playing for this outcome for this player. That's kind of the difference.
Yeah, I agree, and I like Jerry Jeudy a lot this year, and I've noticed he's dropping a little bit recently. So moving over to wide receiver, you have Cooper Kupp ahead of Ja'Marr Chase. The numbers back it up. But Kupp there was actually a time when he was going like 1.9, 1.10. What is it about Cooper Kupp that you have him rated ahead of Ja'Marr Chase?
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy. I mean, before he was injured, he was doing the same, target hog, that we were seeing. It wasn't quite to the level as 2021, but I mean, he had still had 33%.
Because the offense wasn't as efficient, right? Yeah. But I mean, as far as, yeah.
But I mean, he had 33% of the team targets. It was number 1 in the NFL. He was second in target rate per route behind Tyreek Hill. The team loses Allen Robinson. He's a guy that they've shown they can consistently scheme open regardless of the circumstance the offense is in. And, they said, like, you're getting a healthy Matthew Stafford, we hope. And just by default, the Rams are probably going to be a little better anyways because the offensive line will be healthier. You hope Stafford's, healthy. And like I said, proof of concept we've already seen. McVay can get Cooper Kupp open and in a litany of roles too. Last year, he didn't even play in the slot a ton. He was getting more vertical targets and was playing outside more than he was the year prior too, and was still able to get all these targets in this high just bed of floor. I don't have any problem with Ja'Marr Chase. Again, we're picking nits when we're talking about like what number these guys 1 through maybe 5 or 6 are, right? Like the gap isn't wide. And if you're someone that wants to just bet on career arcs, you're going to take Jefferson and Chase over Kupp and Tyreek Hill and Diggs anyways. But yeah, I think when you look at just Kupp's, target outcome and Ja'Marr Chase, what's interesting thing about the Bengals is as good as they are, and as much as we love all the talent in the Bengals, this team has like weird lulls. Like the Bengals disappear sometimes on offense a lot more than their talent level suggests it should. It's like everyone forgets like the opening like 5 weeks of last year didn't exist for Ja'Marr Chase, right? Like everyone forgot. Like everyone was like complaining about Ja'Marr Chase for like the opening, 6 weeks of the season last year. It wasn't until the Saints game when he kind of went off and then caught like this wave of run. But his usage totally changed last year too. I mean, his deep targets were cut in half. He was more of a volume-based producer than I think people realize. But again, we're picking nits when we get into this area.
I agree. It was just worth asking about because it is polarizing. And you don't have to take Kupp ahead of of Chase because if you're doing 100 drafts, you're only going to get a shot at Chase so many times. You've got to take it. Where Kupp tends to go sometimes as late as 7 or 8. You never see Chase.
You're never getting Chase there.
Yeah. Chris Olave, who I do like, is now going middle of the second round. I agree with your rankings that put him squarely in the mid-3rd round, and you have him behind Metcalf, Higgins, and Smith. Why do you think the field is do you think the field has gotten ahead of its skis on a young, talented player?
I think it's just like I said, I keep tying in just like where the landscape is right now. I mean, we've got kind of wide receivers just really inflated in general. Like the price on wide receivers is just really high right now. But I mean, you look at that way teams are drafting right now, and maybe it changes, maybe it doesn't, but this is kind of my area of why, even if you like McCaffrey, he's hard to take as a top 5 pick because of what's left coming back to you. It's a lot easier for me to force Jamar Chase or, what wide receiver, 5 in that area, whether it be Diggs or, you like Devontae Adams, you like Tyreek Hill, because when you come back in the second round, you're staring at Chris Olave, T. Higgins, DK Metcalf, or you're looking at Nick Chubb, you're looking at Derrick Henry, right? So do you want to start Justin Jefferson, Nick Chubb, or do you want to start Cooper Kupp, Nick Chubb, or would you rather start Christian McCaffrey, Chris Olave? I can tell you basically how I feel. I want to start the other way. And so when you get to that kind of firewall here, that's the kind of area where I'm interested to see if it changes, because I think that group of running backs is just a lot better bets, because I think once you get to Olave and maybe all the way through to like wide receiver 25, there's not like a huge gap between those guys. Right. And there'll be a lot of guys we'll get to January and we'll say like, all right, I wish I would have been higher on this guy. I wish I had more of this guy on my rosters and less of this other guy. But right now, there's not a huge gap between even a guy like Chris Olave and Jerry Jeudy, who we talked about, right? When you look at projected target share, when you get to projected offense, it's not a huge gap between these guys. And Chris Olave, who was really excellent as a rookie, I have no pushback on him. But when he was going over the back half of the season, I mean, he wasn't that strong of a fantasy producer the final 7 weeks of the year. Now, are we going to get anything out of Michael Thomas? Who the hell knows, right? But he exists as a variable if he does perform. Rashid Shaheed came on at the back half of last year, and that kind of impacted Chris Olave a little bit. So I don't mind him at all. I just think it's where the landscape is right now, is that these wide receivers that are not very comfortable fantasy picks are in that second round now because of the wide receiver landscape overall. I mean, I don't want to take T. Higgins in the second round. I don't want to take him. I don't really want to take him in the early third round. But it's just the way it is. It's the way it's inflated. That's why I think the drafting right now, I think the optimal way to draft in this pocket of the meta right now, to call it like that, is to go wide receiver, running back, and then just wide receiver for another gap again. I just think that that's the optimal path that has been kind of laid out to the way the public in the meta is drafting right now.
Yeah, I agree. Bijan and it's very hard for me to take a first round running back.
Right.
It just is because of the opportunity cost.
Another guy, guys like Terry McLaurin, like what's the range of outcomes versus Terry McLaurin and Chris Olave? Like how wildly different are they, right? Amari Cooper, and those are guys that are going in the second round, the T. Higgins of the world, the DK Metcalfs. It's not that we're down on those players. It's just the way that the structurally teams are being built right now has inflated those guys who are not as good as just the running back picks at that area, especially in a site like Underdog, where half point PPR is geared itself to make those guys better picks too anyways.
Agreed. Speaking of Metcalf, the field really hasn't dinged him for the JSN pick, and you certainly haven't either in your rankings. What is your thought process on Seattle as a whole? We've seen JSN not get dinged much for his landing spot, Metcalf not get dinged much, but Lockett has gotten dinged, and I think he was the best pick before, and I think he's the best pick now.
Yeah, and I have Metcalf and Lockett relatively kind of tight, and then JSN is more of a guy you're going to look at being maybe like a second half producer, right? A back half guy. I think we've just been really spoiled the past couple of years. We've had these elite wide receiver prospects, and we've had them hit, and they've hit big for fantasy football. It used to not always be the case, but the league told us that they didn't view this wide receiver class as having any of those entities. And then they drafted it as such, right? Like, JSN went and picked 20. It's the first wide receiver taken at pick 20. And historically, like these guys have been mid first round picks or back end first round picks. Like they haven't historically hit the ground running. Justin Jefferson, the one exception, but it's taken these guys a little bit of a slow bake to cook. And I don't think that that's being priced in. I think inversely, the success of the front end guys who had that premier capital in the first place being successful, even Garrett Wilson last year, he would pick 10. It's not like the guy was, pick 25 or pick 20, like where some of these guys were this year, is not being fully priced in. So, I mean, the fact that JSN goes ahead of Lockett is wild to me to begin with, but that's, where we are.
That's like crazy world to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and what's going to happen is we talk about the dead zone. It's the dead zone between now and camp. And then all of a sudden we go to camp and you're like, oh, JSN isn't on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. And then, he's going to drop 2 to 3 rounds. And that's the buying opportunity. My next question had to do with Addison and JSN. I mean, I'm having a hard time drafting Addison at ADP also.
Yeah, and he's the one guy that everyone's kind of glommed onto, has the biggest runway. So it elevated his draft stock a little bit. I mean, circling back to the Seattle thing for one last point, the interesting guy that hasn't moved at all in this whole Seattle thing is Geno Smith. Geno Smith still stands out, even on a site like Underdog or Best Ball, because quarterbacks inherently go higher than they will in your redraft leagues because you have to draft multiple of them, and then the stacking is so prevalent. But Geno Smith hasn't even moved. And, everyone's still drafting these 3 Seattle wide receivers at relatively strong cost, but Geno's just hanging out, which is the interesting kind of component there. But, yeah, when you look at the rookie wide receivers in general, I think this wide receiver class, because the league has told us this, that they're a little more bearish on this wide receiver class than they have been in the previous wide receiver classes. So we should inherently be a little more bearish on them too, for a fantasy stance.
I absolutely am. Let's finish up wide receiver with the Baltimore Ravens. You have Bateman well ahead of both Flowers and OBJ in your ratings. That's how I've been drafting it. I mean, I'll take some Flowers because a lot of times if I have Lamar Jackson, I can take Flowers and get Bateman on the way back, and I don't mind having both. But to me, I mean, Bateman, I know he's got the injury concern, but your thoughts on that situation?
Well, I mean, in the NFL, you're injury prone to, you're not. People are always going to be, if you're a guy that's missed time for 2 years in a row, they're going to say, oh, all right, well, it just means you're automatically going to miss time again, right? That's not how we know. That's not how things work. And it just circles back to where I had these guys kind of as prospects, coming out. And that's more looking at it like Bateman versus Zay Flowers than where Odell is at this point of his career. Bateman was one of these guys I thought literally he almost, in my model, he is almost a similar grade to a guy like Justin Jefferson. He won inside and outside at college, can play basically any wide receiver position. He was hyper efficient last year before he got injured. He's proven that he's a good football player when he can play. So yeah, I want to just be able to buy in on the upside of him kind of fulfilling where I believe, his projection kind of lied as a prospect versus a guy like Zay Flowers, who again, probably a decent best ball pick, will have some home runs. But Bateman, clearly to me, and we've already seen Lamar kind of drop it to us, right? Like he's the wide receiver 1 on the team.
Yeah. I mean, I had 12% early on Bateman on Underdog. And right now I'm looking at, hold on a second. It don't matter. But I think Bateman is, what I like to call a post-type sleeper, right? We were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt last year coming off the injuries, but not 2 years in a row. And, them adding other receivers has really, put him in a range where you talk about arbitrage. Bateman has that kind of, exclusive upside that we're looking for in best ball on the cheap. And how you tailor your wide receiver room, right? I wouldn't put, I wouldn't put Bateman and Kadarius Toney together necessarily with one other guy like that, where it's like the all risk team. But if I've got 2 or 3 really solid wide receivers, putting Bateman as my 4th wide receiver feels really good right now.
Yeah, he's a guy I think just structurally fits a lot of builds, right? Like maybe not one of the like a hyper volatile build, but I mean his range of outcomes is so good that you have the luxury of, if you've gone wide receiver heavy, it just gives you another anchor. But also if you have gone a little bit on the volatility end, it just gives you one more kind of upside bullet to kind of throw at the wall.
Who's 1 or 2 of your favorite late wide receivers?
I mean, I like Bateman. I like Jameson Williams. A little bit hesitant for this week.
No, I mean late.
Oh,
late, last couple rounds.
I mean, trying to think of kind of where I have. I mean, I'm trying to think of how late we're going late. Rashid Shaheed definitely is on the board there. As gross as it is, Devontae Parker is another guy that stands out. I mean, his targets still were consistent last year. He's a guy that still averaged 15 yards per catch. It's gross. I get it. No one wants to pick him. A little bit of Tyquan Thornton for that reason too. Also, not on Underdog, but if you're playing on FFPC or DraftKings, Kyle Phillips is one of my go-tos.
I just drafted him last week with one time, and I said, why aren't I even considering him more?
Yeah, I mean, he's not the prototypical underdog guy that you would draft, but definitely on DraftKings and FFPC, he's definitely on my board on those. I mean, this is a guy. Week 1 last year, he caught 6. He had 9 targets and had 6 catches. You worry a little bit about the potential quarterback change in Will Levis midseason, but I mean, there's really nothing in the way of Kyle Phillips for him to be the slot receiver for a bad offense inherently. But we're talking about a guy that goes wide receiver 80 anyways.
Yeah, I feel like Kyle Phillips is with Will Levis is a very sneaky stack, right? Because week 15, 16, 17, you literally could draft them round 17 and 18 or round 19 and 20 in 20 round drafts and have a really sneaky kind of third quarterback.
Yeah, I like
and speaking of quarterbacks, you're a little lower on Justin. I mean, you are really close to both how it's going at quarterback, but you're a little lower on Fields, a little higher on Herbert. What is your fear with Justin Fields? Because to me, once you take away those 5 games where they didn't use him correctly, he averaged as many points above usable as Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, I think with Fields is just like I've brought this up on a few podcasts. Is just that what he did last year feels very much like what Deebo Samuel did the year prior at wide receiver. The way he scored his points are just unsustainable. So we're going to need to see this change of him as a player, and it does exist in his range of outcomes because where Justin Fields has to improve is the passing mechanic of fantasy football. So Justin Fields is one of my favorite picks last year because of the cost. You know, I love buying guys that are his archetype when they're cheap. And, you know, that's kind of where Anthony Richardson is in that strike zone right now this year, maybe even potentially even Trey Lance. But, you know, now Justin Fields is being drafted as.
What about Sam Howell?
What's that?
What about Sam Howell? I mean, I watched his college tape.
Well, he's mobile, but doesn't have like that kind of rushing.
No, he doesn't have that kind of juice.
He's not going to.
They ran him a lot on dedicated runs in college.
Yeah, his senior year. But I mean, he's not a guy that we're going to like. He's not going to threaten 800 or 1,000 rushing yards.
It's sad that there's nobody other than Richardson, and everyone's on Richardson.
Yeah, I'm the only other guy you can really kind of talk yourself even to having that range of outcomes is Lance, and like he takes such a step of faith, but he's really the only other guy that kind of fits that profile. But now that Justin Fields is being priced in as basically being Jalen Hurts, right? We have to have that Jalen Hurts outcome now because these guys that are the Konami code guys.
No, he goes 12 to 24 picks after Hurts.
But I'm talking. This is where Jalen Hurts went last year.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so like we need that same outcome. And that takes a little bit of step of faith because Fields has just been one of the worst passers since entering the NFL. And he has a couple other bugaboos, like in terms of sack avoidance, which doesn't matter for fantasy football, but it does matter for real football and may be something that limits his, you know, starting caliber perception for the Bears, who still have kind of runway to see if they want to commit to him or not. But you add DJ Moore, you add Darnell Wright to the offensive line. These things can be there. It's really easy to draw that kind of corollary of like, look what the Bills did for Josh Allen, look what the Eagles did for Jalen Hurts and get there. But I don't think the risk is being priced in enough with him either. I'm still high on him. I think I'm QB7. You know, it's not like I'm down on him at all.
But I mean, he goes off for, now that Lamar is signed, Lamar is a solid 4, but Fields is 5th. And you have again, not a big difference. The one guy late that you're way lower on than the field is Jordan Love. Why no love for Love?
I just think he fits that. You can remove the ranking for him, right? Like he just fits a bucket of guys. Like, can he really punch up to be more than like a streamer QB1 type, right? Like, And it's just really hard. It's the same thing with Kenny Pickett last year. Like, what's the gap? What's the ceiling these guys can get to? It's not so much the number that's attached to Jordan Love. It's just the type of player he is, right? That's really all.
I kind of like him because he does have a running ability. He's not like
he's not a statue.
Yeah. I mean, well, he can run. All right, let's move to tight end. We're running out of time. I do want to hit on one or two things. My favorite thing I noticed at tight end is it's kind of spicy, and I agree with it, that you have Waller ahead of Pitts, Kittle, and Goddard. And, I mean, Waller was a big target of mine pre-trade because he was going 2-3 rounds later, and I still like him at ADP. You agree. Your thoughts on why you're so high on Dennis Waller this year?
I mean, just the runway that he has in terms of potential targets. I mean, we know the Giants want to be more aggressive than they were last year. They still kind of added just a bunch of puddle jumpers, and then Jalen Hyatt, who's a third-round rookie. We don't know how much Jalen Hyatt's going to play, right? Like, especially early on. We can't really count on that. So Waller basically is the only kind of vertical target they have outside of Darius Slayton, and Darius Slayton's a fine player, but we saw as the season wore on, I mean, he was getting outproduced by guys like Isaiah Hodgins and Richie James. You can't have that happen to you either. So just kind of the target runway. Pitts is a guy I still monitor because sometimes he falls and sometimes he doesn't. And when Pitts falls, I want to grab him because we know like where the upside lies, but then He's still like nothing Atlanta's done this offseason has given us any type of signal like they want to change, right? And he's still dealing with potential quarterback issues. But we know that there is talent. Like, it's weird because there seems to be like a group of fantasy gamers or, that just think he's bad at football, which definitely is not the case.
No.
This is a guy that he had a 1,000-yard season at age 21. And even last year was 6th among all tight ends in yards per out run. It was just the usage of the offense and kind of the structure of the offense that limited him. But there seems to be a group of people that think Kyle Pitts isn't good at football, which is really mind-blowing to me. We didn't really touch on Herbert, but one of the weirdest things about Herbert last year was like there seems to be a group of people now that think Herbert's like overrated and not one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the world, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me, that people actually think he's bad at football. And like, I don't know how we're getting to this point, just because maybe it's a fantasy dichotomy, right? Like they disappoint, people think they're just bad. And Kyle Pitts, maybe we have to wait a couple more years for the absolute kind of ceiling to hit. But when he does fall, I still do like to try to grab him just in case it comes together.
And he has been more lately because I find myself taking him more. And I think Ritter is very interesting because he does have a running floor. And I think that, it's one of those math equations where you've got Drake London going in the 4th, 5th round. You've got Kyle Pitts going in the 6th, 7th round. You've got Bijan going in the 1st round because of how he can catch the ball. But Ritter is available in the 19th round or 18th round on Underdog. And I'm starting to target those guys and then plan my teams, because not every one of my teams is a 3-quarterback team, but I'm willing to wait on my first quarterback later, knowing that I have Ritter sitting out there in a stack in a beatable Week 17 game with some talented guys.
Yeah, and then like I said, we talked about it with Geno Smith a little bit too. Like you look at the teammate ADPs versus the quarterback and where they're going, and that just inherently right now is a path to find some value on some guys because of where the playmakers are. If all those playmakers are going to hit and fulfill, even 2/3 of those guys, right? Like even if one of Drake London or Kyle Pitts hits with Bijan, I mean, it probably means that Ritter wasn't an abomination.
Yeah, and the numbers are that he was better than Mariota, right? I've seen some things that showed, and they threw the ball more with him than they did with Mariota. I talk about assumptions this week, and the assumption is that Arthur Smith is a complete dolt, but Arthur Smith did pass more 2 years ago when he had Matt Ryan. So maybe, maybe. I like Greg Dulcich a lot. I mean, I know there's some concerns. I have him higher than you. We've seen Sean Payton get a lot out of the tight end position. Talented guy, showed out when he played. Why do you think Dulcich is where he is?
Yeah, Dulcich and Okonkwo are kind of the two guys like everyone wants to make this jump, but where they're going to have to make the jump, it's why tight end's such a slow burn in the NFL. It's that these guys we're absolutely.
You actually don't have him that far down. I apologize. You actually have him ahead of Kmet and Kincaid, and he's been going behind those guys lately. So we are actually on the same page with Dulcich.
Yeah, I think when you get into that strike zone of tight end upside guys, like I said, Dulcich and Okonkwo are the two guys that stand out. But why tight end is such a slow burn in the NFL is because it's treated as kind of like a full-on position in the NFL, and these guys don't have the blocking acumen yet to kind of get on the field all three downs. It's what we talk about with the running backs, right? Like with James Cook and some of those guys. Because you look at Okonkwo and Dulcich, they were so bad in the run game and as blockers last year, and hell, it got to a point where they weren't even asked to do it. And you look at kind of Dulcich in particular, we'll start with him. Every move the Broncos have made have kind of signaled that they kind of still treat that in the range of outcomes. They immediately in free agency signed Chris Manhertz, who has done nothing but block his entire career. And then they go out and trade for, Adam Troutman, Sean Payton's love child. Sean Payton once traded it the rest of his entire draft to get Adam Troutman, who also has blocked first over than he's run pass routes. So every move the Broncos have kind of made have kind of said like, ooh, Dulcich may not be a 3-down tight end and maybe more of just like in on passing downs, which we do want our guys running routes. We also want our guys on the field the full time too. Okonkwo is a little interesting because he's that subset of guy where he's only 238 pounds, right? Like he's 240 pounds. Historically, like those guys don't play as like 3-down guys, in the NFL at the tight end position. Maybe he's just a glorified receiver and we have that kind of run out. But you look at Okonkwo as a blocker last year, and this is why he didn't play in one tight end sets. 47th in run blocking grade at Pro Football Focus last year. He did lead all tight ends in target rate per route run when they did throw out of one tight end sets, but it was just such a small sample. It's hard to say like that's going to be like a huge jump for him. So those guys do take a step of faith, but I do think that those guys are kind of in that upside grouping, right? Like I would much rather just wait on one of those guys than draft like Dalton Schultz, right? Like, and just be like vanilla.
100%.
Like,
I am faced with sometimes Schultz being there a round and a half after ADP and Dulcich there, and it's still a hard click for me. I don't think Schultz is a bad player. I think
he's vanilla ice cream.
Yeah. What's that?
Yeah. He's very much vanilla ice cream. It's not not any shade towards him. It's just that, if I'm already taking Dalton Schultz, like why not wait a little bit and take someone that like maybe has a little bit of spice right involved. Kincaid is probably the one guy like I just can't take him where he's going. No. The Bills historically, we talked about a little bit with James Cook. The Bills historically have slow played all their rookies anyways. It happened on offense and defense. Like they've historically slow played their rookies. Anytime you're talking about a tight end too, and you're saying, well, he's going to be their slot receiver. All right. Like historically they could have just taken an actual slot receiver. That's the weird thing about this whole Kincaid pick with the Bills is like, they could have just taken an actual slot receiver if that's what they wanted and they didn't. So it's really a unique paradigm here. I still think Dawson Knox plays a lot in one tight end sets. And then that again, how much is Kincaid truly on the field? How much are we just trying to run into some potential? It's kind of a weird area. And then you talk about just in general, rookie tight ends aren't good draft picks. They really haven't been historically. So I'd rather kick the can and wait on like Laporta if we're taking a rookie tight end. But very hard for me to push the button.
I didn't even like Michael Mayer that much. But I mean, there are some late tight ends that I really like. I like Isaiah Likely a lot. I mean, I like Jelani Woods a lot. Yes, there are reasons why they might not get the volume, but I think they're talented enough to give you the 3-4 weeks floor that you need out of a third tight end. But if you get an injury to Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely is, shown that he can do it.
Yeah, he's the contingency bet. Jelani Woods was a guy I was prepared to be more bullish on. And then, like I said, the rookie quarterback factor, I think, dinged him a little bit. But for best ball, I think you're still fine. A guy that I think is supremely undervalued in these drafts right now is Tyler Conklin. You look at, there's only been 9 tight ends the last 2 years that have 50 catches and over 500 yards the past 2 years. And everyone's giving all these other Jets the bump for getting Aaron Rodgers. But Kyler Conklin just still goes like tight end 24, tight end 25 every draft. He's definitely been like an easy target for me because we've seen Rodgers will throw to tight ends in the red zone. And this is a guy that's already, I think, been a little bit better than he's been given credit for the past 2 years.
Yeah, I only take him on Rodgers' teams, but I think, I'll throw out one other name that I like late is Jake Ferguson. You get certain people who say, well, Schultz isn't that talented. Dak made him a thing. Well, if Dak made him a thing, I don't think Schoonmaker is going to be ready year one. One of my favorite late guys is Ferguson. Thoughts on that, and then we'll get out of here. We are over budget time-wise. I don't care. I wanted to get to everything I wanted to with the great Rich Hribar.
Yeah, I mean, I'm long-winded too, and we'll get on some tangents. But
I interrupted you at least 8 times to add my wind.
Yeah, Jake Ferguson, no issues there. I believe that he will be the pass-catching tight end of Dallas. I think Schoonmaker's going to be more of a blocker. Those 2 tight end sets. I think Ferguson's the guy you'll see when they go, 1 tight end, and then they have a guy running routes on those plays. Yeah, I have no problem with it. I mean, it's tight end, always that kind of world. I will say this, the one interesting thing, and I wrote about this a little bit for the book and submitted my, Kansas City Chiefs chapter for the book, is as great as Travis Kelce is, and he is deservedly so the number 1 tight end, and he should be the number 1 tight end. There's really no way that Travis Kelce is going to offer as much positional leverage that he offered last year. It was such a historic outlier. The gap that the field had to Travis Kelce, that is advantageous to play in fantasy football right now. You look at last year, the tight end 2 in overall scoring has the lowest scoring tight end 2 in a season since 2016. It was the second fewest points the tight end 2 scored over the past 12 seasons. As a byproduct, TJ Hawkinson was the tight end 2. He only scored 68% of the points that Travis Kelce put up. It was by far the highest positional leverage the tight end 1 has had over the tight end 2 in the past 30 years of fantasy football. Historically, that average gap has been 86%. Last year, it was 68%. Even in the years Kelce previously was the tight end 1 overall, the margin of points that the tight end 2 scored compared to Travis Kelce was 94%, 97%, 95%, 88%, 89%. So by default, the tight end position is going to offer more leverage on Travis Kelce's output, even if he is the tight end 1 overall again this season than last year. And that's something you can use to your advantage in drafts right now.
Absolutely. I will add my thoughts on it. Kelce is a very tough, he was going 7th, 8th, 9th last year. Now he's going 3rd in a lot of drafts.
Because of that.
Look, it was a historic run out. Andrews got hurt. Pitts underperformed, then got hurt. Hawkinson, Hawkinson was fine, but not until he got traded. So, I agree with you. And you got to throw in the fact that he is now 34 years old. Eventually, Travis Kelce is going to slow down. So, yeah, he's a tough click for me right now. Rich, thank you so much for coming on again. I loved your rankings. Overall, I mean, there was not anything that I could look at and said, wow, I really don't like that. I think there were...
You're one of the few.
What's that?
You're one of the few then.
Well, I am not the Twitter mob. That's going to do it for this week on the Best Ball Show, and we will see you next week.